Welcome to the second Nisos Advanced Persistent Videocast with Intel 471. I'm Landon Winklevoss, co-founder of Nisos, and will be today's host. This is our second videocast, and it's probably helpful to provide some background on the format. We bring 3 to 5 subject matter experts from the vendor and industry side and a panel-style discussion on one hot topic in cybersecurity investigations. Today's topic will be measuring return on investment for threat intelligence. And as background, many probably think that threat feed is intelligence, when frankly, it's really only information. Intelligence is when you take information, ideally analyze it to be timely, actionable, and relevant that informs a better business decision. To the end of making better business decisions, oftentimes results need to be recognized as measured in some scalable fashion to show demonstrated value. So today on the conversation, we have Aaron Katz, who's the Director of Global Cybersecurity Defense for S&P Global. Next, we have Aditya Chikala, who's the Director of Security Operations and IT Security Engineering at LogMeIn, followed by Stephen Michael, Managing Director for Nisos. And rounding out the team, we have Michael DeBolt, who is VP of Intelligence at Intel 471. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Moving into the questions, and this is for Steve and Michael for follow on with Adi, Aaron, and then Mike. So Steve, question for you. How do you measure return on investment for threat intelligence regarding actionability, timeliness, and relevancy for the clients that you work? Well, what are some different useful examples, both qualitative and quantitative ROI with regard to threat intelligence?
So we have several Intel feeds that we work with at the client, and we try to operationalize all of them and give them some sort of actionability threshold. So the number that we have is 30% actionability. That's a number that the client and us have decided was a good number. Essentially, the way it works is we'll get the feeds, and as the feeds come in, we'll run them through a decision matrix. And then depending on decision matrix, that feed can be either actionable or non-actionable. And if it's actionable, then we assign a value to it. So that's how we measure its return on investment, say. Certain examples of those is, well, let me start off by just talking about some of the feeds that we get, that we apply this decision matrix to. Some of the feeds might be scraping dark websites. Some feeds might involve scraping like public repos, like GitHub and some of the repos. And some feeds might involve scraping VirusTotal to see if anything uploaded to VirusTotal has any sort of indicator that it targeted the client, right? So taking credential leaks, for example, a lot of times that's often not as up to date as some of the other alerts that we get. Oftentimes we'll find credentials that have been leaked either from like password dumps of like hack sites or things like that are just old. So that goes into the decision matrix as well. Is we check to see if the data is fresh, so to speak, or if the data is old, and that'll affect actionability. Probably some of the things we see a lot, unfortunately, is company data on public repos that shouldn't be there. We often see credential leaks. We'll see network diagrams. Sometimes we'll see sensitive data just lying out in a public repo for anybody to grab. So those are like examples of some of the things that we see coming in. Once we action them, we'll assign a value to them, right? So for example, we actually have a decision matrix here that I'm reading from. So some of the high value alerts that we find is based on data exposure in a public forum, right? So those are like what I just mentioned before, things that are being leaked out on GitHub pages. A medium value might be something along the lines of policy abuse. Somebody might be posting information somewhere online, which he shouldn't be. Some of our lows are, like I said, some of the credential leaks that might be old. Those are the low actionability. So those are like, I guess, our qualitative and quantitative ROI. And of course, we'll tally up the numbers at the end of the quarter, and then we'll present those to the clients. So that's roughly how we measure that here.
Adi, what are your thoughts from that perspective?
Yeah, I think what Steve said, I think we have a similar approach at LogMeIn, but we kind of have a slightly different approach where I know there's the traditional threat intelligence, and a lot of folks kind of separate the traditional threat intelligence with the digital risk protection, the DRP programs, right? So we kind of blend that in at LogMeIn. And I'll start with the qualitative, where for us, we are hugely customer focused. So for us, the qualitative kind of ROI is how quickly did we let a customer know, right? To give you an example, say if a phishing email was targeting a customer and was using a LogMeIn lookalike domain, say LastPass dot something, right, or with a typo in there, we use a lot of services, just like Nisos and other services, where we bring those domains down. So our DRP program, our threat intel program, right? We identify the domain, bring it down, work with the service hosting providers. But the important aspect of, hey, how quickly did we get the comms out to customers, right? Now, that's how we define our qualitative metrics, our ROI, saying how quickly did we let the customers know. And on the quantitative side, obviously, SaaS companies, so how many inappropriate mobile apps or unauthorized mobile apps or malicious domains, right? Lookalike domains, scraping the dark, deep web, like Steve said. So that definitely goes into our metrics, and it actually gets into a threat brief that is reported up to the CIO level, saying, hey, here's the number of domains that we actually look like log me in that were used for malicious purposes and were brought down. And from a qualitative standpoint, these are the number of things that impacted customers, since we're just so hugely customer focused. So yeah, that's our kind of approach to quantitative and qualitative.
Mike, you guys kind of use something a lot very similar in terms of your speed in which you kind of deliver and answer RFIs. Kind of want to dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Steve and Adi already mentioned. Thinking about it quantitatively, you can only really go so far when you're trying to tell the ROI story based on quantitative metrics. It's definitely needed, and some examples for us is how many payment cards were we able to repatriate back to victims for anti-fraud purposes. Steve mentioned creds, so how many stolen credentials are we able to repatriate back to the victim to take mitigative action on? You can set up all sorts of metrics on that, and that's good. We should do that, but it only gets you so far. So I think what kind of the undertone here is that qualitative is going to be key to really tell that ROI story. And when I think of qualitative metrics or measurements, I think of relevancy. Adi, you mentioned timeliness too. I think that's definitely an important aspect of telling the ROI story. And when I think of relevancy, I think of intelligence requirements. I'm a big proponent of basing an intelligence program off of intelligence requirements that are first agreed upon with a handshake between the intel team and the stakeholder. You have to have some basis or some groundwork where you haven't agreed upon. Your stakeholder has actions and decisions that they need to make. And as an intel provider, as an intel team, your job is to support those decisions and actions. So it's about measuring the relevancy over time. How well am I doing? Intelligence requirements are very simply just questions or gaps in knowledge that your stakeholder is seeking to answer. And as an intel team, you're supposed to be providing answers to those questions. So it's about, from the very beginning, setting up what those intel requirements are, having an agreement with your stakeholder, what you're going to provide to them, what questions you're going to answer, and in what format. And then over time, being able to measure that. And the key here, and I'll just wrap up by saying this, is feedback. You need feedback from your stakeholders over time. You got to establish that feedback loop. And that's something we've been able to do at Intel 471 to really gather and document that input on really removing the ambiguity around Intel production. Are we either relevant? Are we matching those and satisfying those Intel requirements or not? And if they're positive in their feedback and ultimately they're saying that, yes, you are relevant, you are allowing me to take action based on the Intel deliverables that you have, then I think you can kind of point to that as justification and help you tell that ROI story.
Aaron, what are your thoughts over the kind of staying on the feedback theme from that perspective? Are you thinking about this quantitatively and qualitatively very similar? And certainly what kind of feedback is generally, what are the different kinds of feedback you receive from a lot of the different stakeholders with S&P?
So that's actually a really good point on the feedback. And it's something we learned when we pitched to get a threat intel program. The program's not even 3 years old. And the questions are always, how do you measure success? What are you going to do? And it was important right out of the gate to make sure we socialize why we have an intel program. What are we supposed to be for? My reasons are not going to be the same as another company's reasons. And just a metric that shows numbers but doesn't tell a story isn't helpful. And a lot of the feedback we get is pretty much, what can you do to help the business? You're not there to just give the SOC a list of IOCs, call it a day and say, cool, we got threat intel. It doesn't matter how many feeds you have coming in. That's a number that doesn't actually tell anything. But when we started getting feedback, when we put out the daily threat briefs, that now goes to most of our C-level executives. It goes to several hundred people throughout the company across different business lines, technical, non-technical, and they provide feedback on what's important to them. So we've had focus groups with them. We've had surveys that we've sent out. And to Mike's point about PIRs, like priority intelligence requirements, those are extremely important. We spend probably 6 months really ironing out and solidifying a process. And you can have, here's a metric of how many times we've executed the PIR successfully. A low number is not a bad thing. It's all about the context of what you're measuring. But what's more important to us was qualitative. What's the value that we're giving our stakeholders with threat intelligence? Are we helping them when there's a merger or an acquisition and we're doing an assessment to see what is the risk we take on? Have they been targeted by other entities, and does this raise our threat profile? That's where we find a lot of the value. So sometimes I can have a metric of conducted one M&A assessment. Sounds like a low number, but it's actually provided a lot of value. So it's been really important that we build out what is the service catalog of threat intelligence and how do we make sure that that's executed consistently.
How many use cases of business risk have you addressed with traditional cyber intelligence? I think you kind of made a reference there to merger and acquisition type work, but around fraud and marketing and cybersecurity, physical security, application security, vulnerability management. I guess I'd be curious to hear kind of the depth of where your intelligence program has been applied, and of course it's like any security professional, we love the stories, right?
So from our side, it's ironically because my team is freaking awesome and they are very good at what they do, we end up kind of collecting use cases. We've worked very closely with our privacy team and our legal team when there's privacy assessments or reviews, if there's concerns about vendors or jurisdictions where we do business. S&P, if you see our offices, we're in over 30 countries. You can imagine we have very different threat profiles depending on the business unit, depending on the product, depending on the new laws that come out. Depending on who we issue sanctions against, we see attacks depending on the business. So our Intel team gets involved and we work with our lawyers and we help them with those types of assessments. But then that kind of naturally led us to work directly with our vendor risk management team, where they'll come to us and say, do you have any intel? Like, we're looking at this product. I saw some news articles about them. It seems that they really get attacked or that they're really in the news. Is this something we need to worry about? If you've seen all of the supply chain breaches over the last couple of years, that's something that we now start taking in as a use case. We start doing supply chain assessments to see from our vendors, what intel do we have to determine how would we detect an issue on their side? Have they had issues that may not be public? And we spend a lot of time building these types of reports. We've done country risk assessments when we've decided, hey, we want to expand our presence and we want to double the number of people in this country. We've actually helped them assess what is the risk, what do we need to worry about. So we kind of get pulled into a lot of different areas. Our physical security team especially, we work very closely with, whether it's devices that get stolen and sometimes determining if that was malicious targeted intent versus someone just saw a shiny toy that they could sell on eBay. I'm sure we've all had those fun stories. I know in previous life, I've worked some incidents where someone's laptop was stolen for the information on it, and suddenly a competing product came to market. So it's definitely important that your Intel team is really good at marketing and branding themselves, because you have intelligence. It's not just information. You're actually helping take the data from all of these different groups that may not know how valuable it is to other teams and helping them extract value out of it.
Adi, what are your thoughts from the LogMeIn side? Is it very similar? I've talked to a lot of individuals, mainly Mike Rennie on this, and he was kind of giving me a variety of different use cases you guys use as well. Certainly welcome your additional dialogue there.
Sure, again, Mike is awesome. So apart from what Aaron said, we kind of do the similar things. We're trying to get to the physical security aspect of what Aaron mentioned, but we work very closely with our legal and our risk team, right? From a use case of a business risk that got addressed, I mean, the slightly different aspect to that is we hear that from non-security folks that, hey, security folks are working in a silo, the threat intel team's doing the secret squirrel stuff. So the approach we have taken is we are actually getting the dev community into the process, right? We work very close with the dev community. One example is every time they're doing a threat modeling session, Mike, like you said, Landon, Mike Rennie kind of works with the specific dev team and say, here's your product, here's your landscape, here's the different threat groups that target similar products or actually have targeted our products in the past. And you see the light bulbs go, right? And we, like you said, we kind of try to build that story for the dev team. And they take the threat modeling session a little more, not that they don't take it seriously, but I think it gives them more context on how an attacker could do this, right? So very close working with the dev team to help them understand the context. On the marketing side, I mean, small things like TweetDeck or watching Twitter. If somebody's posting something, hey, LastPass, or hey, go to meeting, you've had this problem, for example, right? threat intel team quickly hops on it, gets the right people involved. And similar with legal, right? I mean, one example that I can give is the UDRP takedowns, right? I mean, they're expensive, they take time. So if legal identifies something that could be taken down, they quickly work with Mike Rennie on our threat intel team, and if we can bring it down, it's just faster and cheaper versus going through a UDRP process. So similar with social media team. So slightly different approach where we very focused on the legal, the social media, the marketing side of it, and the dev community.
One question I do have for Adi and Aaron before we kind of move over to Mike and Steve from this perspective. A lot of people talk about, when you talk to insider threat folks, they say that the best intelligence comes from when you actually talk to people that are working at, in the stakeholder positions or in the business units, and they'll feed you information. Would you think that those are similar approaches for the threat intel side as well, that it's almost a human-centric approach as much as it is getting a variety of different information and threat feeds as well? What's your general approach from that aspect as well?
So I would absolutely say you have to build relationships. Threat intelligence, if you don't know how your company makes money, if you don't know what they're working on, what value can you really provide? The best part is we get a lot of intel because of those relationships with our stakeholders, with people who are on the product side, who are behind the launch of a new product, and they'll come to us and say like, hey, they're talking about doing this, it's a little weird, or hey, we're looking at using this technology stack, but I just saw in the news that there's this whole massive conspiracy around it. What do we need to worry about? It's getting that dialogue, getting that information is really important. If you don't know what's important, how are you going to build intelligence requirements? Your stakeholder is not just your security operations center, your incident response team. It's the company as a whole. So building those relationships is one of the most important things any intel team can do, in my opinion.
Right. And I think what Aaron mentioned even a couple of minutes back, he said, knowing your environment, right? Every environment's different. Every company is different. The requirements are different. And in my mind, how do you understand that environment and how do you understand the company without engaging with different stakeholders, right? To his point, it's super important to get the stakeholders involved. I mean, we have seen examples where, similar to what Aaron said, right? I mean, we engage with the dev community and they're like, hey, we're building this product. I was searching for this code online. I was on Payspin. I saw these credentials. Do you guys do something about this? And I mean, we've got reports from the dev community while they're working on a product dev process, reporting something abnormal, right? So yeah, super important. And I think if you have to know your environment, you can't do that without building those relationships with your stakeholders. Super important.
Yeah, Mike, what are some of the different use cases that you've seen with Intel 471 customers? And generally, would you kind of agree with what's been stated so far?
Yeah, absolutely. And, from a vendor perspective, we touch on, a number of different use cases to help support our clients and also help to support our clients' internal stakeholders as well. Some of the obvious ones, fraud intel, vulnerability management. But I do want to touch on, because I think it's really important, something that both Aaron and Adi said, around probably the biggest one that we're seeing around business risk, which is related to third-party supply chain risk. I mean, every single day, we're seeing not one, not two, but numerous threat actors going into underground forums on their instant messaging platforms and claiming advertising potential breaches of organizations from around the world, representing all sorts of different industry verticals and markets. And some of these are derived from, ransomware is a big thing, right? So some of these are derived from ransomware incidents where the actors are going out and blackmailing victims saying, pay or else we're going to expose your private or sensitive information. Others, we're seeing organized crime groups who have infiltrated maybe a large corporation and now they're reselling access to it either through, they've gained access through password spraying or exploiting a vulnerability. Anywhere from those or to a lone wolf actor who's opportunistic and they just want to make some money, right? Regardless of who it is, we're seeing a lot of breach-related activity, unfortunately. And I think with all of this activity happening, naturally, organizations are going to be like, okay, how are we impacted directly? Are we breached? But to Aaron's point, these organizations with large vendor supply chains who are engaged in mergers and acquisitions, they have a real serious need to be aware of breach events that are related to those vendors, to those potential partners. So approaching this from a vendor, like an Intel perspective, what we want to do is we try to lower that noise floor and really identify and track the most prolific, credible threat actors that are involved in this very specific activity. And our job really is to highlight the emerging trends, the TTPs associated with them, and really remove the FUD for organizations who would otherwise have to sift through all the junk to make a proper risk-based assessment. So I just wanted to, it's definitely something that we're seeing trending upward, and we continue to see it. Something we need to be aware of. I'm glad we mentioned it here on the call.
Steve, what are your, from your perspective, who are the main recipients of kind of the work that you've done, and where have you kind of seen that grown, outside of the traditional SOC?
So right now we have three major consumers of our threat intel data. So we have the IR team, the vulnerability management team, and the threat hunt team. The IR team is primarily concerned with things that can be actioned immediately, right? So they're concerned with things like credential leaks, so they can just easily change those passwords. They're concerned with things like the public repos being exposed, tracking down the users that own the repos and having them take it down, things like that. That's probably the biggest consumer of a lot of our threat intel feeds is the IR team. We also have the vulnerability management team, so they're mostly concerned about vulnerabilities within the tech stack. We'll report to them any sort of vulnerabilities that are being exploited, if there's any POCs available to the public, if those particular vulnerabilities are currently being exploited by certain threat actors. All those are factored into the decision matrix to see how quickly they need to respond to some of that information as it comes in. And of course, we have the threat hunt team, where the threat hunt team is more concerned with TTPs and IOCs that are currently being seen, not only just TTPs and IOCs that are being seen used by actors, but also particular TTPs that might be subverting or bypassing our security controls. Part of what the threat hunt team does is they consistently test different types of TTPs that actors are utilizing to see if the security controls will pick them up. And if they can't pick them up, that's great. If they can't pick them up, then we'll create threat hunts around that. So some examples might be particular ways to obfuscate code, or particular ways to create a macro that might give one of our AVs or EDRs a hard time. Other things that we've been utilizing lately as well, outside of our traditional threat intel feeds, is through our partnerships with security teams with our business partners. So we've had several occasions in the past few months where the client's business partners have been compromised with ransomware. And since we have a relationship with their security team already, they'll go and disclose certain IOCs that they found on their end. They'll share those with us, and then those will be passed over to either IR or the threat hunt team. And then they can go ahead and action them. And that's been very helpful, especially with ransomware, because upper management, I think that one of the things that they're most afraid of is ransomware. And when some of the business partners get compromised, it's very scary, because these business partners have direct links into the network, either through some sort of VPN connection or through some sort of a VDI connection in. So they want to make sure that, number one, we can prevent the ransomware from spreading, and number two, to check and see whether or not those ransomware actors actually did make it into the network. So that relationship we have with those business partners can provide us some of that threat intel.
And actually, just to jump in on that ransomware talk, because everyone's probably seen it's all over the news. I can tell you over the last couple of weeks, our Intel team has been putting together a lot of work at the request of multiple stakeholders to understand what is the difference between these types of ransomware? What are the cases where people are paying out? Are there any stats on who paid out? Why did they pay out? What do we need to worry about? What's the risk? Are certain groups more trustworthy than others? There's a lot more research that is now going in. So it's not about, here's a hash that's known to be ransomware, go block it. It's also understanding what are those tactics, techniques, procedures that you have to worry about. And we've been putting together presentations. We wrote a very lengthy report that's been shared out, and we're starting to put together more executive briefings for the C-suite so that they can understand more about what is ransomware meaning to us and what are we doing to try to detect and prevent it. And that's been really beneficial from the visibility of the Intel team.
Yeah, and I could speak to some of that research as well. So the threat hunt team does engage in some of that research. So when we get our IOCs for the business partners, they'll get things like hashes or IP addresses, things that can typically change, right? We will go ahead and block those, but we don't just stop there. Some of the things that our threat hunt team will do is they'll actually go research the hashes or the IPs and look at virus total samples and see if they can link some of those samples to other samples and see if they can actually attribute those IOCs to a particular actor or a particular group or a particular tool set, right? From then, they'll expand on those hashes. Oftentimes, we'll find code signers that were used by the actors, and then we'll grab those signers and block a signer, and then we'll query the signers in virus total to see if any other samples were signed by the same code signer. And that's some of the ways that we're able to do some of that attribution. And like I said, the past few months, we've had a few business partners be compromised by ransomware group, and the threat hunt team was able to attribute 2 of those cases to the same actor based on some of the research that they did by looking at virus total samples. They looked at things like mutexes, things like code signers, like I said, and callback domains, things like that. So yeah, we start out with those hashes and those IOCs, but then the threat hunt teams grab those and just expands on it to do some of the things that you just mentioned, Aaron, like find out what groups are involved and who's been paying up and who else they've been targeting.
It's been mentioned a couple times, over the past 30 minutes around the decision metrics and then what the chain of events in terms of who reports and who is ultimately able to action. And I think it's obviously with large organizations, those types of things are ultra critical in terms of being timely. So Mike, I'm just curious, from what are some different decision metrics that you've seen come out of use cases that streamlines an organization to increase actionability on your side? Aaron, Adi, and Steve, follow on from there.
Yeah, I mean, one area, we've seen it in several areas, but I think one area that I think Steve actually touched on was patch prioritization and vulnerability management, where I think traditionally maybe Intel wasn't part of that process or part of that decision tree. I think that's changing more rapidly. We've seen some gains in that area. And I think it also touches on the conversation we were having earlier around information versus intelligence. So when you take a look at the traditional patch prioritization and vulnerability management process, right, we would like to think that we have the right pieces in place. We know the CVSS scores of disclosed vulnerabilities. We might know if there's a patch available or not by the vendor. We definitely should know our tech stack internally, our crown jewels. We have all those pieces put in place to make a better assessment of which patches to prioritize and which not. But taking from an intelligence perspective and adding some context around vulnerabilities, we need to start answering questions like, what are the threat actors out there actually saying about this particular vulnerability? Is anyone actually searching for POC code or asking for an exploit? Are these exploits getting baked into attack frameworks like Metasploit and being able to track the life cycle of particular vulnerabilities over time, and then using those inputs to help kind of round out the patch prioritization process and the decisions that I need to make to do that. So we've seen some of our customers actually take those observables and the context around them and adjust their patch prioritization based on the input that they receive from that intel. So that's just one area. I think vulnerability management is going to be a use case for Intel moving forward, and I'm glad to see it.
I definitely want to echo that. The vulnerability management's getting really important. The problem at a lot of companies, especially the large organizations, is you have a ton of technical debt, you have a ton of systems, and your crown jewels are never what you think they are. You think you have a list and suddenly there's this system someone forgot about. But what's important is when these vulnerabilities come out, I'm sure every one of you, when you've had a system, a C-level executive comes up and says, do I need to worry about this right now? Do I have to patch it immediately? Can I wait for the weekend? Can we do it as part of our 30, 60, 90-day process, or do I have to do it immediately? And at a certain point, it's not about the CVSS anymore, because a vendor might say it's super critical, but you can have a system that's completely air-gapped and no one has access to it. Is that an emergency? When you have your Intel team able to say, here's the chatter we're seeing the exploit actually being used by actors in the wild. We see that they're targeting all these groups. That helps you set that priority and figure out what do you need to do. And we do that across the board. We look at our Intel team trying to get plugged into a lot of these major decisions, whether it's new ventures that we may do in certain other countries, whether it's acquisitions, trying to see how can we help, how do we provide that value so that it's a decision point. No, don't stop an M&A just for that, but go in risk informed. And that's our goal. Security is a function of risk, and the Intel team's job is to help provide valuable business intelligence.
I'm going to piggyback on what Aaron and Mike said, the vulnerability management aspect, just because it's so important. The approach we did at LogMeIn is that's the whole reason we actually have the threat intelligence and the vulnerability management as one team. We call it the TVM team, and I know every company kind of does it differently. It just helps seamlessly feed that information really well. One of the metrics that we pull is, hey, out of all these thousands of vulnerabilities, what's the percentage of vulnerabilities that's actually exploitable, right? And that number is kind of provided by the vendor itself, but from a threat intelligence standpoint, we kind of vet that information too, right? Like Aaron and Mike said, if you're saying here's your 15 critical ones for the week, go patch them, but 6 out of them, there's already a POC out there, it's already exploitable. I think giving the context to the stakeholders, otherwise, like you guys said, it's just data, right? There's no context, but you tell them that, hey, this is not just numbers, but we have 6 active POCs going on for this vulnerabilities. I think huge impact. We have seen people just have the light bulbs go and they're like, oh, yep, patching it right now, understand, things like that. So I think the vulnerability management aspect is really important. And from a decision metric standpoint too, I think from these use cases, I mean, an example that we have seen is where somebody reported something abnormal, the threat intelligence team kind of picked on it, vetted that information and said, oh, this does not look good, turns into an incident, right? And like all of us do, there's an incident, we have a postmortem and an action item that comes out of it. I'm sure a lot of us do that too. As part of the action items, it's pretty well tracked and measured and saying, hey, these are things that the different business units have to do, right? They're documented, measured, and tracked. So I think it's just a different kind of approach or aspect where the whole kind of life cycle of threat intel, somebody reporting to threat intel, to the IR team, to the stakeholders actually getting these action items for remediation, right? So that's the kind of approach that we have at LogMeIn.
Steve, what are your thoughts from that perspective?
I guess we're all in agreement here that vulnerability management is very important. It should be a very important consumer for threat intelligence. Right now, out of the three areas that I mentioned before, incident response, vulnerability management, threat hunting, vulnerability management has the most involved decision matrix out of all of them, just because vulnerability alerts that are coming in for vulnerability management could potentially trigger out-of-band patching, which could be very expensive. So we actually try to be as detailed as possible in that decision matrix that we put together. We actually have 12 or 14 rather different scenarios that we put together, and these scenarios involve like whether or not the vulnerability that's been released is being actively exploited, whether or not there's a public POC out there, like the ease of use, essentially, whether or not it's wormable, whether or not our appliances or applications are exposed to the internet, or is it just internal? So like all these things and others are factored in as to whether or not we should set up some sort of out-of-band patching. And it's actually not just the vulnerability management team that gets tasked, it also brings in the threat hunting too. So even though an out-of-band patch might be put in place, it might still take some time before these patches come in. So that's when the threat hunting team has to come in and they start looking at logs and running queries to see if between now and the time the vulnerability has been patched, if any of these systems have been exploited. Sometimes there's been cases where the threat hunt team was tasked to monitor and see if there's any exploitation attempts to some of these devices, just to find out that there is no logging coming in from these devices. So now we have to go after the right people to make sure that the right logs are coming in. So, and all this could have just come in from like one alert. So one alert could have cascaded into many different teams having to work together to make sure we, number one, get the right logs, make sure that we have the right threat hunters involved, and make sure that we get it patched in a timely manner based on our decision matrix. So yeah, vulnerability management is probably one of the most involved consumers of our threat intel feeds.
One last question, I guess, outside of vulnerability management, I guess, who would be probably, I guess, the next largest consumer where, decision tree, in terms of timely and being timely and actionable, what's probably the next biggest consumer?
Say from our side, it would be our incident response team, because there's going to be times, especially in an incident, you have to make like rapid fire decisions. And having that intel to back it up can help you determine, is this a run-of-the-mill commodity crypto mining malware, or is it a front for something else? Is it someone where they ran a script, got in and was able to run something, or did they physically get on the box and start messing around? Having the intel team able to kind of look at those situations, determine what are the tactics, tie something to an actor, helps you understand what is the real scope of your issue and what decisions do you need to make probably rather quickly.
Right, and similar, right? For me, at least for LogMe and for us, I would actually say even though vulnerability management is probably the most important aspect, the key, it's actually not our biggest consumer, right? We would want to get there, but to Aaron's point, incident response, by far the biggest consumer. We have an incident going on, an investigation going on. The threat intel team in the back end, in the background, is actually running all this information and saying, hey guys, give us more information we're feeding, any contextual information we're feeding for that incident and investigation. So incident response within the security team, I would say, is probably the biggest consumer. And I would say outside the security team as a stakeholder, I think the dev team, we've seen huge value there, working through the security champions, working through the business relationship managers, and working with the engineering teams and helping them understand, I would say, is probably the biggest consumer of this knowledge or information outside of the security team.
It's very helpful. No, I think that rounds out the discussion points, and certainly welcome to open up the floor for questions.
Okay, I guess a question for Aaron, because you have a program you said that's been around for 3 years, right? Which versus the program I've been working on that's been around for a few months, right? Maybe 6 months, 7 months at this point. When you first started out with the threat intel program, how long did it take to get to your first iteration, say? Like, when did you get to the point where you said, okay, now we're mature enough to say that we have something going and every modification moving forward will just be a minor modification here and there, or have you ever even gotten to that point?
So PIRs, it's a little under 3 years old, and we just had PIRs kind of solidified this year. But what we did that was really important, I feel, is we treated it again, marketing and branding, getting InfoSec, talking to people, breaking out of a silo, working with our stakeholders. And the daily threat brief was one of the first products we put together. And that is daily. And that goes to several hundred individuals across multiple business functions. And that we focus on right away. We made sure we focus a lot on this. You always hear the strategic, tactical, operational sides of Intel. We focused a lot on the strategic side at first, showing here's the value we can bring in, here's the expertise we have. Sometimes it was deep research into, hey, we saw this piece of malware that looks really tied to something we need to worry about. Just because we might have blocked this, odds are there's other things out there if they're targeting us, and having Intel team research that. And even if it turns into nothing, when the C-suite starts seeing like, hey, they did this report, they looked into this, we do need to worry about it, and we got lucky this time, it really helps. So we didn't focus as much on IOCs. We're not as focused on integrating a feed into a SIM. We do have a threat intel platform. We do have some feeds going in. But at the end of the day, a lot of it is proactive research that supports our business that we've really got the most bang for the buck on.
I'm just curious. I think it's the daily threat brief is a really solid idea. I'm glad you've been able to get traction on that, man. I'm just curious about the content. So what's the ratio between externally sourced content and internally sourced content that goes into your daily threat brief? In other words, how much are you focused on like situational awareness externally versus here's what we got going on internally?
So we've hit that weird point where we've gotten so much attention and so many people that want it that at times the briefing can sometimes feel diluted because what's important to one group won't be important to the others. Mm-hmm. So we do have our briefings kind of split at times. There's the reading list, which is here's some of the major headlines or news articles we think you should see, and then usually a deep dive into one or two, whether it's an internal or external event, usually something external. But then we have an analysis of what does it mean to S&P. So for example, with a CWT paying that ransom, we put in like some information about it, what happened, and then we had a separate section that says, what are S&P's controls to prevent ransomware? What do we have as a non-exhaustive list? What would we do in a situation? So it makes it more relevant. That's the biggest problem we've heard when we got a lot of feedback at the beginning is that the news articles are news articles like that they see in the Wall Street Journal. What does that mean to the company? That's what we focus a lot on, is just making it somewhat relevant.
Trying a quick point to that. I mean, we don't do a daily threat brief. We do a weekly one. Like I said, I would love to get to a daily one, but it does. I think the issue we're having, it seems like it takes time. And I think it's right now, it's just information overload for folks when we do it at a daily cadence. But what we also do with a threat brief is not just a threat intel data. It's not just articles saying, hey, here's a competing product that just had an issue. That's not, we do that too. I mean, there's contextual threat intel information there. But we also provide the vulnerability management data. Here's the percentage of exploitable vulnerabilities. Here's the high criticals or number of critical externals you had, just because it goes to the exec management, right? And then we have major incidents, right? So it kind of does the whole security operations, the incident response, the vulnerability management, the threat intel, just a high level information. So it's not just, hey, go here, read these 5 articles, but more contextual information. So yeah, just a quick comment there.
Because also one thing that we're looking at right now is because everyone loves containers, but you have a lot of people that use containers but treat them like a monolithic application. And we have a lot of people asking us, do we see any actors really going after people that have containers? Are we seeing malware that's more targeting them? What is our risk if we have a bunch of containers, if someone can jump out? What are we seeing? And it's one thing like we can say like, oh, Pierce security architecture says X, Y, and Z, but when the Intel team can go, hey, there's a lot of chatter about this exploit on Kubernetes, we need to actually be careful and be cognizant of what's going on. That's been extremely valuable. And sometimes we'll just do like flash reports, like just a one-off, like, hey, we're seeing something.
One of the questions I routinely get is, from Intel team is, we want to do a standing report. We want to do a daily threat brief. Or we want to do a monthly intelligence summary. What are we going to use as inputs? How do we even start that process? And I think we've said it ad nauseum at this point, but it all comes back to stakeholder requirements, right? And what are your priority collection? So for us And we're a little different because we're a vendor. So our primary stakeholder is actually the CTI teams within the clients that we provide intel to. So what we've done as a proxy is we've taken the PIRs from each one of those clients and we've run it through a weighting scoring process where we actually have a set list of collection guidance, standing collection guidance that we use for our daily, quarterly, monthly, quarterly production. And the guidance for the team at Intel 471 is we have a 75-25 model. 75% of our work, our daily work, is going to be trying to map to those intelligence requirements, those priority intelligence requirements. Then the other 25% is really to kind of be flexible. And we realize that some of the things that our stakeholders are asking for, maybe they don't know what they need. So it's about identifying those collection opportunities and production opportunities based on our placement and our access into the areas that we have so that we can identify those emerging threats and report on those. So I don't know if that helps. I know some people might be listening and they're like, well, how do I even get to a point where I'm doing a daily or a monthly? My suggestion, my opinion, is starting with requirements from your stakeholders, really doing a good job of prioritizing and focusing your efforts that map to those requirements, and then leaving a little bit of wiggle room to do the things that kind of, Aaron, you mentioned, which is hitting on those newsworthy items that you're going to get asked about, right? You're going to get asked about the CWT ransomware event that just kicked off and CNN is all over it. So being prepared to answer that question and also being prepared to say, hey, we don't know, we don't have all the details on it right now, but here is our action plan for covering down on that is also another important thing that we really haven't touched on. It's okay to say we don't have any information on it. That's still intel. But it's not okay to say, well, we don't know what we're going to do about it. So having a plan of action to cover that is also really important.
Yeah, the plans of action are really important that you hit on there, because you want to make sure that your stakeholders have the sense that you're on it. And something could be in your backlog because it hasn't been prioritized there yet, but it's always better to say we're getting to it than we have nothing. Sometimes you might have data that might not be relevant, but when you share it, becomes relevant. Just as an example to share what we saw recently, we saw a huge amount of registrations of someone spoofing our benefits website. All of them located within a specific country with a specific hosting provider, and they pretty much were just going through all the one-offs by letter to go after our benefits site. We had no other information than that. There was nothing really bad. It was so new, but just having the bare bones of that, we were able to go to other groups who started saying like, oh, that's actually somewhat similar to what we saw over here. It still might be worth sharing just because they might have data that helps you connect the dots.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you mentioned that. And it comes back full circle. We were talking about timeliness, right? As a measurement of return on investment back to your stakeholders. And that is a key aspect of it, getting the information out in a timely fashion so your stakeholders can take a look at it and take the action that they need. I think one of the things that bogs down Intel teams is they tend to think that their information is evidence, when in reality it's intel. There's a line between the two. You're making an assessment based on what you know at the current state and your previous coverage of whatever the incident or the threat is. You're making an assessment at that point in time. It is evidence-based, but you're not going to a court of law with this information. You're just giving it as it is right now and allowing people to make their own assessment on it. So I think that starts to bog down the timeliness factor when you retain it, you hold it, you wait for more information, and it prolongs being able to send it out to the stakeholders for them to take action on it.
Awesome. I thought this was fantastic. Aaron, Adi, Mike, Steve, can't thank you guys enough.
Welcome to the question and answer session. We have Adi, Aaron, Mike, and Jeff Moore substituting for Steve Michael on the Nisos side. First question from the audience: do you believe IOC should be shared with the IR team?
Short answer, I think it is. I think it's a great idea. In my opinion, more eyes, the better it is. It also, I think, depends on the nature of your company and if there exists, say, classified data or not. People have security clearance or not, things like that. So I think it depends on the nature of your company and environment too. And can everyone look at the data around these IOCs? But I work for companies where I didn't have the right privileges to see the whole data. But I think sharing just the IOCs, immaterial of it being classified or not, is always a great idea. I think the incident response team, in my honest opinion, is There's one team that's trained and skilled to sift through logs and historical data and kind of connect the dots based on their experience working through different incidents or investigations. So that's the kind of longer answer, but the short answer, I think it's a great idea and everyone should. And we have seen huge success doing that.
Next question, how can internal red teams and CTI teams work more proactively together to inform the blue team threat hypotheses?
That's a good question. I think the red team, to be successful, really should work with the threat intel team, making sure that the attacks they're going after are rooted in something you're actually worried about. It's really cool sometimes to go after esoteric threats, something you saw at a really cool Black Hat presentation, but that doesn't really impact you or there's no real likelihood. By working with the intel team, you can kind of put together a plan of attack that's relevant to the company that can then be turned into a lesson learned for the blue team on how to improve their detections and how they can actually build upon it versus, hey, this is really cool, but it's a 0 day and not much we can do. I have a lot of thoughts on just using 0 days on red teams.
And just to add to Aaron's comment there, like mentioned in our panel discussion, right? I think the vulnerability management aspect of the function is super important. I think combining, I mean, you said CTI, Landon or whoever asked the question, but I think combining the CTI and the VM function and feeding that data to the red team, right? I mean, say you have this X vulnerability now, the CTI team is actually vetting this data saying, hey, this is actually being exploited in the past. And you give that data to the red team, and they testing that against different environments within the company. I think that whole circle of life kind of makes it effective, in my opinion. So what I'm trying to get to there is involving your VM team or your vulnerability management team as part of your CTI team is key. And I think it gives more contextual data than just, hey, here's Wild Wild West, go test this 5,000 vulnerabilities that's in the report.
Yeah, and
Jeff,
just to echo that real quick, yeah, because you mentioned proactive, you mentioned the word proactive, so I think that's really good. And just to echo what Adi and Aaron said, when I think of proactive, I think of situational awareness, right? And this is very key for the CTI team feeding the red team for threat emulation, for threat reproduction. I mean, what this means is that analysts need to be actively covering and reporting on, Aaron, you mentioned this and you hit the nail on the head, current and emerging actors, malware, delivery methods, all those things, with the goal to provide the most accurate picture and the timely picture of threats out there. So I think that's a really important piece of it. Being proactive means, establishing coverage over those areas and reporting that in a timely fashion.
Jeff, what are your thoughts?
The way I see it is every large organization I've ever worked with has had issues with asset inventory and asset management, and frankly, not understanding the details of their network layout. So this is especially true with large companies that acquire smaller ones. So you can use your red team activities to add an understanding of your technology stack. Red teams are always going to find that old XP machine that you forgot about, or that internet-facing SQL server that you didn't know existed. So having this additional knowledge of your tech stack can inform your threat intelligence analysts on what they should be concerned about, and in turn develop threat hunt hypotheses for your hunt team.
Next question, you mentioned that one way to measure return on investment is by using threat intelligence requirements. How do you suggest going about using these requirements from stakeholders, especially from those who may not understand what a threat requirement is?
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to try not to get on my soapbox here. So I think it's important to remove the FUD on what an intel requirement actually is. I mean, that's part of the challenge we have when talking with stakeholders. And I mentioned it before, right? An intel requirement, it's simply a gap in knowledge or a question that informs their decisions and actions. So once our stakeholders understand this, and also that we are there not as another cog in the wheel, but to actually help inform them and to make their jobs hopefully a bit easier. And we've come a long way already in our initial discussions. The other thing I'd like to touch on real briefly is about perception. I think as an intel team, a big part of our job is to convince the business units around us, our management, of who we are and why they need us. And perception matters. So me personally, when I think about perception of an intel team, I'd like for our stakeholders to view us as their eyes and ears. And I kind of take back to my Marine Corps days. We considered ourselves the eyes and ears as infantry scouts. We went ahead of the battalion. Our job was to push ahead of everybody, paint that picture of the battlefield so that the units in the back who had to make the decisions about what moves to make were better informed. So, when we observed a tank move into sight, we'd report that along with the characteristics, what it looked like, any potential weaknesses it had, so forth. I think this is a similar mindset and concept we ought to communicate as Intel professionals. We are the eyes and ears of our stakeholders. So with that in mind, and to the question, when you're talking with stakeholders, I would start by asking questions like, open-ended questions like, what can I help you to see that you're not seeing right now? What are your blind spots? What are your 3 biggest gaps? I think, once you can start there, establish priority Intel requirements, and see where the conversation goes from there. And then at that point, it's just a matter of delivering on those requirements and being able to measure that over time.
Yeah, and just to echo off of that, it's extremely important that your Intel team works with the business and with your stakeholders. You don't want people thinking of the Intel team as a group that sits in the corner churning out feeds of IOCs. It's really, really important. You work with your stakeholders, understand what they're worried about. One of the reasons that I think our team's been as successful as they've been is they've sat down with stakeholders and asked, how do you make money? What are you worried about? What business operations do you have planned in the future, and what are you concerned about? And actually understanding how the business functions helps us refine what do we actually need to worry about? What actors could potentially be interested in us if we make this move? And it's gotten to the point where we have people coming to us saying, we plan on increasing business operations in this country, and we'd like to understand what the Intel team might have to say about it. Here's what we're looking to do, and build a dialogue. We don't want to just be seen as providing those IOCs. It's providing value and strategic intelligence.
Besides threat intelligence platforms that aggregate feeds, where else can automation assist with the replicating of attacks to derive new defense strategies?
When we ingest a new TTP from threat intel, we want to use that for 3 purposes. First, we want to generate a new threat hunt hypothesis for the threat hunting team. Second, we want to generate a new use case for the SOC within our SIM, where automated alerts occur anytime the TTP is observed in the environment. And the third thing, a customer of that new TTP would be the red team. And what we'll want to do is build a tool to replicate the TTP so we can test that our threat hunt methodology and our SOC use case rule is effective in preventing or detecting the threat. So, and that's where automation comes in. We want to automate that red team test so we can repeat it and ensure our rules are still effective over time, because the underlying network may change, the data feed into the SIM might change, firewalls might get moved around. And we want to automate that test so it's not a manual process.
It's not a lot more to add to what Jeff said, but I'll just quickly give my 30 seconds comment on that one. But we do have the usual automation, right? Automation of the feeds coming in and to your incident response life cycle. But I think where we're trying to get to with a pretty new offensive program in place, it's less than a year old, is to use platforms like Vector, right? Which could be used for tracking your red team and blue team testing activities, right? And it measures your detection and prevention capabilities. But taking that platform where the red team and blue team are testing each other's capabilities, but also feeding that data into your SIM tools of choice, right? So that's sort of what Jeff said is what we're trying to do is automating that testing capability. And there's only so much you can do, in my opinion. I know we have strong opinions about automation, but my opinion has always been there's only so much you can do to automate things. But that's where we want to get to from a testing capability.
Aaron, what are your thoughts from that perspective? I'm sure you have something to add as well.
I have a lot of thoughts when it comes to automation. To be honest, I would also caution a little bit with automation, to be honest. Make sure that you think about what you're trying to accomplish. We've talked a lot on this call and some others. You want to provide value. You want to make sure it's relevant. The biggest challenge I've seen sometimes with automation is treating it like a fire hose, kind of just throwing in, I've enriched everything. Look, I've pulled it from 20 different sources, but now each of those sources say different things. So refining your automation, making sure you invest in your automation team. It's not just purchase a vendor's tool, say that we have something, but you actually get people that apply that analysis before it gets to that automation platform or have it baked in, you can save everyone time and make sure that an analyst can actually see something that's malicious much more quickly than they would if they had 20 sources to go through. Automation can do a lot, but you want to make sure that when your automation includes shutting off a system from the internet, that everything that led up to that is really ironclad.
That concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for listening to the first Nisos and Intel 471 videocast on the return on investment for threat intelligence.